What an irresistibly captivating round between these two players. This pugnacious round on the tabletop arena was holding attention for being the longest game in the World Championship history with a mammoth 136 moves which lasted for 7 hours and 47 minutes. It was also the first game in which it took 2 days to win the game. The game ended 17 minutes after midnight. So let's start with the game. Magnus was white, Nepo was black. And d4. The fourth game was a solid draw with 1.e4 and was held easily by Nepo. So Carlsen opts for 1.d4. Knight f6, knight f3, d5, g3, e6, bg2, bishop e7, castle. The Catalan as in the second game but without c4. Castle, b3. Again, aiming for the break with after c4. c5, d takes c5. I would say c4 leads to a more typical position, but I would say d takes c5 was also in Magnus's prep. Bishop takes c5 followed by c4 now. D takes c4 and now a very nice move. Queen c2. Being able to recapture the pawn with the queen at least and therefore not weakening his pawn structure because you cannot really take the pawn because the bishop would be hanging. So black defends the bishop on c5. Knight bd2. Magnus in almost all games has sacrificed a pawn and again is offering one more to Nepo. He can easily take on b3 but Nepo declines it with knight c6, wanting fast development instead of pawn grabbing. Instead, something like c takes b3 was also possible and the machine is not exactly scared of capturing the pawn. And after knight takes b3, something like bishop d6, knight fd4, white seems more comfortable. However, our robotic friends give this position as equal. Knight c6, knight takes c4, and now d5. Now, trouble may come on the long diagonal because the knight and the rook is just being aimed by the bishop on g2. However, black has enough tempo to get out of trouble. Here I would say e5 seems a slightly better move as the bishop now has scope on the e6 or g4 square. But b5 is nonetheless not bad. And now knight ce5. How is the bishop coming to b7? Just a quick note that knight fe5 might seem tempting, however it's losing because of simply knight to d4. Getting the tempo against the white queen, queen d1, and now bishop b7. Black gets the clear initiative. So knight ce5. And now knight b4. First, playing this is very important. Because if you play bishop b7, then it simply loses material after knight takes c6, bishop takes c6, and now b4. Using the pin. You can't take it because of the bishop on c6. And if bishop takes f3, bishop takes f3. Oops, a8 and c5 are hanging. So knight b4 was very important, gaining that one tempo. Queen b2, and finally bishop to b7. a3, and now again knight c6 is possible because the queen is no longer on c2 and therefore this move is safe as there is no b4 coming after knight takes c6. Otherwise, if the queen was on e2, c2 like something like this and black plays a random move, this time of course knight c6, bishop takes c6, b4 would be better. And he would have to give up the exchange after something like bishop d6, take. But of course, queen c2 cannot be played and even if played, h6 won't be played. So knight d3 instead, attacking the bishop on c5. Bishop b6 and bg5. Rook fd8, bishop f6 and g takes f6. A very interesting decision because normally you would play queen takes f6, just trade off the queens before getting this bad structure as in this position the king would be kind of weak. With the queens on board, the queen can give like checks on the g file anytime soon. So quite an interesting position, but on the other hand, I think Nepo didn't really want to exchange the queens and wanted to play this game forward and make it complicated. Rook a c1. Knight to d4. The e5 first briefly, but I guess it's not the best move because even though you are wanting to play e4, white is simply knight h4, and this just weakens the f5 square. Something like knight to d4, well now e3 again. bg2, king g2, queen b7, that's no use as king g1 is simply there. And okay, knight e6 is possible, but it's quite scary right now because black has knight g5, knight f3 threats coming, so it's quite interesting how this would have been played, but then again, this is inhuman to play a move like this. Because queen e2 is coming, something like queen g4, and then knight f5. It's not that good. So, knight d4, knight takes d4, bishop takes d4, and queen a2. Now, the queen is quite passive on a2, but what to do? Because it has to also defend this a3 pawn. Bishop takes g2, king takes g2, queen b7, and queen e4. And now queen c2. Again, once the queen was freed from this defending a3, it simply comes on the open file. a5, rook fd1, king g7, rook d2. Magnus spent some time on this move, and the clock situation was 25 minutes for Magnus and 35 minutes for Nepo. And we also have to remember that there is no increment because they got 2 hours at the start without any 30-second increment. So he was playing for 25 minutes and he had to play that for the next 15 moves. And now Nepo decides to imbalance the position, rook a c8. This is of course not a bad move and it does liven things up, but it strikes kind of risky as well because after queen takes c8, rook takes c8, rook takes c8 happened in the game, white has the 2 rooks for the queen and normally the 2 rooks are better. And in this circumstance, it is still equal here because white's weak pawns are just a disadvantage for him, but white was able to defend them properly with b4. Now a4 and e3, the bishop on d4 has to move somewhere. Bishop to e5, and again the machines claim that this is still a draw, but I would say bishop e5 was not the best move. Something like bishop b2 might have been a better move because first of all you can't take the bishop because of the rook on d2 which would be hanging, and if rook c5, well queen to d6, rook takes b2, queen takes d3, and now white's position is actually quite dangerous because the a3 pawn is losing and the d1 queen d1 check is coming and all of these nasty threats are coming. White would have to play rook bc2, the only move, because after queen takes a3, white has rook takes b5, something like queen to d3 attacking both rooks. Well now simply rook bc5 again, a3, and white is able to defend both these pawns properly. Because the white has rook a5 first of all, and if something like queen to b1, white will just maintain it with rook f1. And there is no progress being made. Something like b5 can be possible, so let's say e5, b5, f5. Now b6 won't be possible as simply you can even take this or just play h5 again. And once the pawn is actually threatening to be promoted, something like queen takes b7, and this is actually just a theoretical draw. So quite a big line, but bishop b2 would have been way more challenging than the move played by Nepo, which was bishop to e5 and h4. Now it's quite an interesting one because still, again, what is white's idea with h4? Well, now bishop b2 could have been played. Well, again, white is wanting to play rook c5, and now rook takes b2, queen takes d3, and we get the same thing but with the pawn on h4, which would of course be slightly better for white again. So white has real weaknesses to play against after h5 because the h5 pawn is now quite weak, and it's quite interesting why he played h5. Maybe he was scared of some threats with h5, h6, and maybe if white is able to double up the rooks on the 7th file, take on f7, take on h7 with check, the h pawn could be quite annoying for black. But h5 I feel is just a bit too much. Better would have been bishop b2 like I said, but then again, it would not have been the best decision as black just played bishop e5 in the last move. But black played h5 and now king h2. And okay, black is still fine here, but black is just given this weakness on h5 and white is just waiting with king h2, king g1, playing just natural moves and just wanting to say what black is going to do. And bishop b2 now, but this is too late for this because white is winning after rook to c5. Queen d6, and now rook d1 was played, and this let a very big chance slip because first of all, Magnus was in clear time pressure with less than 10 minutes on the clock and there was no increment like I said. So rook d1 seems natural as wanting to play something like rook a1 if you take on a3. But the best move here was actually to play rook c2, attacking the bishop and now threatening to take. So the bishop has to move somewhere, something like bishop takes a3 could be played, and now knight to f4, taking advantage of this h5 weakness. And white has a decisive attack, believe it or not. Something like queen e7, and now rook to c8. If you take this b4 pawn being quite hungry, well, simply rook dd8, and this time rook g8 check, rook h8 check, rook g8 checkmate. So I'll just show it to you. If a3, then check, check, and checkmate. And somehow these two rooks and this knight is just checkmating the black king, and you can't do anything about it. So it would have been quite risky, and black would have to play quite precisely to maintain the balance. So here after knight to f4, queen e7 might not be played. Something like queen f8 would have been necessary to stop rook c8 or rook d8. But then white would have rook d7, this time pressurizing the f7 square and attacking e6. So black has to play king to g8. So that knight e6 is not coming. And simply knight takes h5, attacking f6. Bishop takes b4, rook to c7. Or something like knight takes f6 check will be coming. So a3, check. And this would just end in a draw after something like this, because black can never go to the h-file without losing to rook takes f7. So quite a complicated line, and rook cc2 of course would have been played by Carlsen if he had some more time, but it's quite a hard move to find when you have like less than 5 minutes on the clock. So rook d1, a big chance was gone. And again, this is maintaining equilibrium. Bishop takes a3, rook takes b5, queen d7, rook c5, and e5. I'm not exactly sure why black just didn't take on b4 and just win another pawn, but maybe he had seen some ghost. However, I think bishop takes b4 works perfectly fine, as you of course can't take as the rook on d1. And maybe something like knight b2 could be there, but simply queen takes d1 is there. And after knight takes d1, bishop takes c5, this endgame is completely winning. And after bishop takes b4, if rook takes h5, then again a3. And this time it's too late to defend this pawn as the rook is out of play. So white would have to play something like rook cc1, bishop a5, and maybe he had evaluated this position as drawn and thought that e5 would be better and he would get some more play in it. But then again, both positions are kind of equal with slight edge for black. Rook c2, queen d5. Again, why not bishop takes b4? I don't know. So queen d5, rook d2, and now suddenly white has everything under control, and the a3 bishop is in some trouble because it can't go to b4 right now, as this time knight takes b4 can come as the rook on d2 is defended. Black has to play queen b3, rook a2, e4, and knight c5. If queen takes b4, which happened in the game, now Magnus has a clear winner. Instead of knight takes e4, which was happened in the game, simply rook dc2. And this should win easily because black's queen and the bishop is kind of stuck. The bishop can't move anywhere right now, and so can't the queen, because the queen is defending the bishop. And so something like f5 would be played. Then simply knight takes a4 even, because queen takes a4 is met by rook c3, winning this bishop. And this time it would be winning for whites because are quite weak. So a demonstration could be something like if queen d1 and queen f3, putting this here. Well, now rook a5, attacking f5 slowly. f6, rook d5. King g6, rook d7. And slowly just white would just maneuver his pieces with something like rook a7 coming. Of course not now because queen takes f2 is there. But slowly like something like, okay, f4 should be played, or otherwise something king h6 can be met by rook to f7 attacking f6. King g6 can be met by simply rook d7, and just repeat the moves followed by gaining some more time. And here, okay, if the queen moves anywhere, this would be a big blunder. Not d1, sorry, but g4, something like. So rook a7 would be there, rook g7 check followed by checkmate. So black would sometime get into zigzag. King h6, rook e7, king g6, and then rook to d2, rook d7, rook g7. Step by step, gaining the advantage and winning the game. So rook c2 should have won somewhat easily, but knight takes e4 was played. Queen to b3, and finally the 40th move has been reached, and 1 hour extra for each person. And though, okay, they still don't have increment, but it's still fine right now because they can think and try to figure out the lines. And right now black is more or less okay. Rook a c2, bishop f8, knight to c5, queen b5, knight d3, a3, and knight f4. Slowly, of course, the knight on f4 is much better placed attacking h5. Queen to a5, rook a2, bishop b4, rook d3, king h6, rook d1, rook a1. Slow maneuvering of the pieces, but finally white will win the pawn because simply rook takes a3 here. And bishop takes a3. Then now rook takes a3, and white should be totally winning because despite it's kind of equal with the queen versus rook and knight and pawn, the queen's main strength is being able to attack so many things at once. But here black has nothing to attack, only this f2 square. Other than that, everything will be defended, and white will simply play a move like rook a5, rook f5, and then rook f4. And finally, when the rook is on f4, let's say imagine it here, then rook takes f6 would be possible, attacking the queen, and the knight would then maneuver itself towards the f6 square, and everything would be fine. So yeah, bishop takes a3 is not possible, and black plays the best move here. Queen takes h4 check, using the pin, and g takes h4 is not possible. King g1 and queen e4. Again, if you can't take on a3 this time because of the queen, and so queen e4 has to be played, and rook a4. So now we get this position. Let's just evaluate it first of all. 2 rooks versus the queen. The material is roughly equal, with white being 1 point off 10 versus 9. And black has these weaknesses on f6, f7 and h5, which are quite apparent. On the other hand, white has a backward pawn on f2, but that's gonna be very hard to attack. On the other hand, black does have the bishop against the knight, and bishop is normally better compared to the knight, because like something like it can move along and maneuver quite quickly, attack these pawns on f2, especially that the f2 pawn is dark squared. But right now, white is always going to be pushing. Bishop b5, knight e2, queen to c2, rook 1 a2, queen b3, and yeah, the bishop on e5, like I said, is incredibly well. King g2, queen d5, f3, queen d1, f4, bishop c7. Again, just some more moves just to get the position into the best shape, maneuvering all of the pieces in. This position is kind of important because white has coordinated his position about as well as possible, because anywhere else the rook, if anywhere else the rook goes something like 2a6, well then all of these squares would be quite weak. And so how is white going to push forward for the win? Well, White played exactly like it. Rook to e8. Tried to get control over the 8th rank and give some checks. f5, rook a8. And queen b4 simply. What's the threat? If you played rook g8 check, well now, simply king f6. If you play rook a b8, well, okay, queen b3. How are you going to push forward for the win? If knight d4, fine, queen c2. Oh, sorry, queen b2 check. King b3, queen b1, threatening queen f1. Checkmate. King f2, and this might even be just a draw. So white plays rook a c8. Warning, of course, that after bishop a5, black would be threatening some checks on e1, so this rook can come to c1. Bishop a5, rook c1, exactly in the game. Bishop b6. Black really has nothing to do. Rook e5, queen b3, rook e8, queen d5, rook c8. Just repeating some moves just to get some time. Queen h1, queen d5, rook b1, and bishop a7. And this is a bad move. The first slow mistake. Of course, Magnus is the best when it comes to grinding the positions and squeezing that water out of stone. And bishop a7 clearly shows why. Nepo makes the slight mistake and white pounces on it. Rook e7. Gaining that one tempo. And now rook e5. And again, there's only one move. Black has to play queen d3, maintaining this pressure on e3 square. Rook b7, queen c2, rook b5, bishop a7. And now white played rook a5. I would say a more human move would have been rook takes f5, and I think this is also possible, but queen d3, rook f7, rook d7, and this would still be a draw, however, white would be pushing. And this is roughly what happened in the game. Rook takes f5. And this time... And so how do you evaluate this position? White has a rook, a knight, and 2 pawns versus the queen. And these 2 pawns are actually passers, and they might create some havoc on the board. On the other hand, the queen, being the majesty and being the queen, can move around anywhere, just give some checks, attack both pieces at once, and white also has to be quite precise. And I would say this position is drawn, but it's quite hard to draw with a human playing on the board after 80 moves, and he has been sitting there for so long thinking. Almost both the players would be drained out by this time. Rook a6 check, king h7, rook a1. And now, no need to rush. Black was threatening to play something like queen d1 or queen h1, so we're just stopping that. Next move may be rook g1, rook g2, coordinate all the pieces and then try to push the pawn. King g6, knight d4, queen d7, rook a2, queen h1, rook a6 check, knight f3. White's king is totally safe because this knight is quite a good piece here, controlling all of these squares, and black can't really give a check from h2. Of course, right now h4 would be prohibited because of the g pawn, and white's king is quite safe here. Queen b1, finally threatening a check. Queen b2 check or queen c2. Rook d6, king g7, rook d5. Just some more moves here just to gain some more time, as there was 30-second increment here. King f6, rook c6 check, king f7. And finally, white has not made any progress over the last several moves. But the checks, and the clock, just keep on going lower. Even though you're giving checks, and you might be gaining those moves, but black still has to play quite precisely. And black cannot hold this forever. And slowly, and finally, knight g1. He tries to set up a different coordination. Rook d1, rook d6, rook d4, knight e2, and finally e4. And okay, machines still say it's a draw, but playing 50 more moves, because after e4, 50 more moves are allowed, and then e5, and then another 50 moves and so on and so forth, and black will be tired by that time. But Magnus didn't take that approach. Queen h1, rook d7 check, king g8, rook d4, queen h2, king e3, h4. Black trades off his last pawn, but that doesn't really change much, and he still has a practically impossible job. Gh4, queen h3, queen h4, and some more checks, some more moving, and finally this very interesting move, knight g3. This is a very good piece right now because it's controlling all the squares. Can come to e2 anytime it wants, just stopping this check. It's controlling all of this, stopping like the blocking the g file, so that from checks, and so king f3, king g4 might be played slowly, or king g2, and of course it's helping in pushing the pawns forward. Queen d2, queen d1, queen b3, and okay, step by step, rook e5, rook f5, e5. Machines still say it's a draw, and even here we have to play 50 more moves to just draw. Oh. And here, e5, queen a2 check, king h3, queen e6. This was the decisive mistake according to the table base. Instead of queen e6, there were two moves which drew. First of all, queen b1 or queen c2. The main idea is, of course, to attack this rook. So something like if queen b1, then if white tries to play a move like e6, well, everything draws simply. Something like king e7 draws. But why does queen e6 fail? That's because of king to h4. And finally, the king marches up the board, and this time the machines are confirming that this Magnus is winning the game. Queen h6, queen h7, and now e6. Queen g6, rook f7, king d8, f5, queen g1, knight g7. And finally, in the end, this enormous fight between the intrepids was won by the Mozart of chess, Magnus Carlsen. He showed his trademark style of squeezing water out of stone from a drawn position, and it worked well for him. That's it for me. Thank you for watching. Bye.